Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, What Life Was Like in the Industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I am your host, Carrie, and joining us today is local historian and creator of the Historical Tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Como. He personally offers and leads public and private tours, as well as presentations of historical sites around communities in the state of Mass. Currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tours spotlight the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various parks, streets, and selected historical houses within each community. So in today's episode, we'll be discussing around Wistariahurst in Holyoke, Mass. So what is of interest on the Beach Street area side of Wistariahurst?
Okay, so yes, it's surrounded by 4 different streets on this rectangular structure that the lower section of Holyoke has. And so it has Beach, Cabot, Pine, and Hampshire Street are surrounded. And we're going to tell you about those in terms of what's outside. If you're on the sidewalk, look out from the block. So most people know very well on the city block is beautiful William Skinner's house, Wistariahurst, which was brought from Williamsburg in 1874. And that's why the house itself has no architectural look to the houses around it at all. It also takes up a whole city block because he was given that. But the homes around it developed through time. Now on the Beach Street side, sadly the best home of all, burned in a fire December 18th, 1973. The 6 occupants of the home were awakened by a baby crying on the first floor, and the fire department was called, and they couldn't put a fire out, so it destroyed the whole building. And that building was made in 1885 by the George Clark, who was a treasurer of the Newton Paper Company. He had built up here because it was so nice, and it was the first home besides Wistariahurst to be put in this place. And it's the first home within 3 blocks of Wistariahurst to be built there. Wistariahurst was never built there, it was built in Williamsburg. Sadly, I have pictures of it, but sadly the building's gone. It had a brick facade on both floors, and it was a gorgeous building. The Clark family, besides the husband, had a son, George Clark Jr., and he would become a medical doctor based out of Boston and specialize in diseases. And the family would live there for about maybe about 60 years, and then it would transfer over to being apartments. All right, so it's a great start. Now, the next street coming along, we're going to go in clockwise fashion. So the next street coming along is
Cabot.
All right. So the features on Cabot Street that we're going to emphasize is diagonally across the tip of Cabot and Beach. There's a home there which was built in 1885 also. So 2 homes were built right away across Cabot and Beach, and they complemented very well the Wistariahurst. This one was Henry Seymour home. He was the head of his own company called Seymour Cutlery, and then it was taken over by Samuel Whiten, who was the son of William Whiten, who was a very famous person in the history of Holyoke, probably one of the most famous of all, or at least top 5. And his son was no slouch. He took over the mills, and he also was involved in the political structure of Massachusetts itself. A little bit up Cabot Street, you can see in the distance a portion of Oak Street called Fairmount Square, but across Cabot Street at Oak, you'll find the Nautilus, which used to be a Victorian home, and using that as a base, that home was surrounded by bricks, and then an addition as large as the home itself was put on towards the east, and it became the Nautilus, a newspaper, a magazine, and it stayed around Holyoke for about 70 years. Now, Cabot Street itself has more, but they're at the tip of Pine, so that's going to be our next point.
But quickly, before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, if you want to find out more information or sign up for any various tours, you can check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org, and there you can find videos and podcasts of the stops along each of his tours, as well as photos and text of the historical sites throughout as well. And for other inquiries or private tours, you can email him directly at bobcat4214, capital B, at yahoo.com. And his tours make for fun, educational, outdoor activities for families and group parties. So getting back to our interview, how about on Pine Street?
All right. So near the corner of Cabot and Pine Street, there's many nice homes. Right on Pine Street itself, at that corner, is the McCarthy home, and that was built in the later portions of the 1880s. J.J. McCarthy lived there with his wife, and when she died, she was so beloved around Holyoke that there was a lot of people that were very upset when she died. Her husband was a bar owner. He was very social. She was the head of a couple of choral groups within Holyoke, and two of her daughters were elementary school teachers within Holyoke. And so a lot of people knew this family. And when she died, many, many hundreds of flower bouquets were sent, enough that it filled every room on the second floor, every room on the first floor, the entire wraparound porch, and then the entire lawn front inside. Hundreds of flowers were sent. When J.J. McCarthy died 15 years later, they said in the obituary, "Do not send flowers." So this home was very, very popular. Across Cabot in the same direction was the Herbert Frink House. He was the owner of the Holyoke Machine Company, a company that made turbines and other machinery for the textile and paper mills of Holyoke. And they stayed in existence for 150 years in Holyoke and only moved last year. So it was started and it grew as Holyoke grew greatly. Now, that home, Frink home, was from 1885. And two houses down, there was another home, the Stern home, also made in 1885. And across the street from both of those homes I've mentioned, but in the middle of them, was a Reverend's home, and that was from 1885. So 5 houses came in 1885, 11 years after the Wistariahurst was put around there. So a lot of changes happened around there. Remember, there was no trees in this section of Holyoke, and so William Skinner could go in the second story of his home, look out and see the canals and see his business, and that's not true anymore. Now, one more very important home on Pine Street, and that was the George Brakey home, the first of the brick facade smaller homes along Pine. And he was William Skinner's a personal carriage driver, and then when cars came around, he was a personal chauffeur. And William Skinner actually bought out this house from Brakey, and Brakey and one of his sons was the chauffeur of the Skinner family up to 1943. And so from 1890, early 1890s to then, about a half century, this Brakey family was tightly combined with Skinner's family. And in fact, George Brakey was not only the chauffeur, but he was also the head of the men staff at the Wistariahurst. So this family was very tightly intertwined. And his son, one of his sons, got married in the garden of Wistariahurst. And so this is a very important house, probably one of the most modest, but probably one of the most tightly tied in to Wistariahurst and the Skinner family.
And last but not least, how about Hampshire Street?
Now here we have to leave from being very residential to being institution-based. Across the street from 1896 to about 1968 was the 4th edition of Holyoke High School. And in 1964, it did move up Beach Street a bit to its new home, but in 1968, it burned to the ground, and very sadly, because it was a gorgeous school built by the most prolific architect and construction firm in Holyoke, for institutions, and that was George Alderman. And beyond that was the auditorium gymnasium for Holyoke High School. And then in that same block beyond it was also the Holyoke Trade School, where vocational instruction was given, and that became Dean Technical School. All three of them are long gone, so it's now a block that have modern institutions. So you had a beautiful view. If you were around here about 1900, you would have beautiful new homes on three sides. And on the last side, the Hampshire Street side, you would have gorgeous institutions. So what a block it became. But when it started out in 1874, very simple, a big home on its own city block with a beautiful garden. And it's still, of course, one of the most visited locations in all of Holyoke.
And thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours and historical topics of your expertise. And we want to thank our listeners for tuning in. And you can check more of his podcasts on his website, as well as on SoundCloud.com. And be sure to stay up to date with new videos and podcasts posted daily. Thank you for tuning in. Okay, and so today he will be educating us on the Wistariahurst Museum. So, what is Wistariahurst?
All right, it's a house that belonged to William Skinner when he was in Williamsburg and running the Unclemonk Silk Milk. And sadly, in 1874, the dam on the Mill River collapsed and it killed about 200 people and also destroyed all the mills, their livelihood, their houses. The Wistariahurst survived because probably it was pinned down to the ground by two very strong chimneys. And in 1874, he signed an agreement with the Holyoke Water Power Company that he could buy the land where a house could rest. And he moved Wistariahurst piece by piece, by cart, to Holyoke. And he built a new silk mill in Holyoke out of the remnants of his silk. And so Wistariahurst is the house of the Skinner family, where William Skinner raised his kids. Many of his children went on to help him in his business, including William Skinner and the son, and Joseph Skinner, who majored in chemistry at Yale and came back and learned how to apply dyes better to silk, and also his daughter Belle Skinner, who lived there a long time and ended up giving the house away to the city. Now, Wistariahurst has changed through the years, and we'll talk about the way it's changed. Physically, it hasn't changed too much, and outside, it hasn't changed too much. The perimeter around it hasn't changed too much, but what happens inside has changed, so that it might have started out as the home, then it was given to the city, they changed it to a museum, and then the whole aspect of the museum has changed, where it's been changed from a research center, which it still is, and also a walk-through museum, which it still is, but it also has services that it has programming for people to establish themselves better in life. It has a lot of woman programming, which the Skinner sisters had tried very hard to do within Holyoke. And so it's great that it changes with the times and people can still use it at a very high level.
Now, what buildings are around the perimeter of this house?
All right, so if you look around by the perimeter, I mean the street perimeter or the sidewalk perimeter, if you walk around the house, its front is technically on Pine Street, and at some point Belle Skinner, one of the daughters, had changed the front to be towards Beach Street, and that was because she didn't like certain of the neighbors. Also, to the south, it's bordered by Hampshire Street, and to the north, it's bordered by Cabot Street. Now, so fine if you walk inside the house with the gardens, great, but what if you walk around the sidewalk and try to figure out what life was like at, in 1900, 1920, around this beautiful Wistariahurst? What are some of the wonderful buildings around it? Well, one building that's of great interest is at the northwest corner of this beach in Cabot, and there's lots of gorgeous houses in Cabot. So once you go out what was considered to be the back door, the carriage house area, and walk to the corner of Beach and Cabot, you see at the northwest corner again, Henry Seymour's house. It later became Samuel Whiting's house. And Henry Seymour was a cutlery dealer. He made scissors and other cutlery, and he made it in Holyoke, but his showroom and sales room was in New York City. So that gorgeous house is his. And then, if you look on the opposite corner of Cabot and Pine, it's the home of Herbert Frink, and he was the president of the Holyoke Machine Company, the big turbine makers of the world. Well, at least in Holyoke, but also spread out across the country. And that's important because Holyoke had the best test room in the world, and their turbine makers were mostly the Holyoke Machine Company. They existed in Holyoke for over 150 years and only went away a few years ago. Now, what about more modest homes at Pine Street? Well, if you go out on Pine Street, remember that used to be the front door. And if you look out left to right, some pretty good houses. Well, the first one is a story, the one on the leftmost. And that's 244 Pine Street. That's the home of J.K. McCarthy and Kate McCarthy. And one incredible story is that Kate McCarthy was so popular because two of her daughters were elementary school teachers in Holyoke, and her husband was a bar owner on High Street in Holyoke, and they all had great personalities. And Kate was head of a church choir group. When she died in 1909, there were so many flowers in the house, every room in the house, every hallway, that they spilled out onto the porch, a wraparound porch, and they spilled out onto the yard. There were many hundreds of people that bought big bouquets of flowers, overwhelmed the house. That's how much she was loved. When her husband died, they said in the obituary, "Don't send flowers." All right, now the next very important house is the brick house that you see on Pine Street, called 264 to 266 Pine Street. That was the home of George Brakely, and that's important because he was the coachman for William Skinner, the son, from 1909 to 1937. George Brakely and his family lived there. And he was around for so long that he even served William Skinner, the father, too. So he's around 1890, but most of the time he was around for the son, and he needed a place to live. The carriage house might have been on the property of Wistariahurst, but the home where this person who was the coachman for William Skinner was across the street in this little home. Now, William Skinner thought so highly of him that he bought the house for him, and so William Skinner owned that house. Now, as you look towards, if you go up to Hampshire Street, and if you look to the south, what used to be there is very, very important. Sure, there's some homes, but most importantly was that the Holyoke High School was there. You may know about the Holyoke High School on Beach Street, but there used to be one built in 1898 on this corner near Hampshire and Beach. And it didn't burn down until 1960s. And at that point, it turned into other things. But there was a beautiful 3-story high school at this position. Now, the last street, of course, is Beach Street. And if you go out there, of course, you see some Victorian homes. But the dominant feature of Beach Street itself is the Wistariahurst and its beautiful gardens. So I hope you take a tour given by the staff of Wistariahurst inside and outside.
So quickly before we continue with the rest of the interview, just to fill our listeners in, if you want to find out more information or want to sign up for any of his various tours, you can check out his website at hoyokecanaltour.org, and there he has both videos of the various stops along each tour and also past and present photos of the historical sites throughout as well. And if you are interested in setting up a private tour, you can email him directly at bobcat4214 @yahoo.com. And they are perfect for fun and educational outdoor activities for the whole family, or for group parties, especially those special occasions and get-togethers. And they're also good just for getting outdoors for the day. So getting back to our interview, how has Wistariahurst changed through the years?
Physically, it hasn't changed much, and they actually intentionally try to keep it up to date to make it look like it was when it was made in the 1840s. And it's applied for some community preservation act grants to keep it up to snuff with paint, with helping fix the front porch on Pine Street, with trying to keep the electricity up to snuff inside, keeping the carriage houses and music rooms, so forth. So physically, but spiritually, it's changed from a place with a lot of services and a lot of programming. You can now have weddings there, of course, and you can have presentations there. And presentations could be about the Skinner family or Wistariahurst itself, but it could just be about history of Holyoke, history in general. And there's a lot of extra programming to match what children do. They have a new program called Wisty Wednesday for children, and they also have a lot of women programming because two Skinner sisters, Catherine Skinner and Belle Skinner, were both into helping immigrant women, and they started up a settlement house on Main Street. And so it's good that you have this continuum at Wistariahurst.
And what about the gardens?
Okay, now the garden has changed through time. In the very beginning, it was a fairly simple garden. Remember, this is a full city block they're on, and they're the only house around. And the garden is gorgeous now. It might actually look somewhat closer to the ancient garden, the one from the 1870s. But along the way, they ended up having a Japanese-style garden. And that's because, remember, they're a silk company. And they used to make silk from the silkworm. And to have a Japanese theme is very appropriate. Some member of the family had gone off to Japan for business reasons and come back with thoughts about how to improve their garden. And they've had professional gardeners through the years, and that was very important to them to keep it up. Nowadays, it's all done by volunteers, and it's a great garden to wander around. You can see many kinds of flowers and other kinds of plant life, including trees, so forth. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tour. And we want to thank our listeners for tuning in. And you can also tune into a large selection of our other podcasts and much more at his website, again at holyokecanaltour.org. And again, you can email him directly for private tours or to inquire about anything else at bobcat4214, and be sure to keep an eye out for his upcoming 2024 season tours and more as they become available. Thank you for tuning in.